In the light of war, all we see is darkness. A brutal picture is painted from the shattered pieces of hope, from grand ambitions and broken spirits. Each time bombs rain down, it feels like a painful blow to the heart of humanity that cherishes peace. Along with the thunderous sound of explosions and the fiery breath of bullets, the flow of money into wars surges like a waterfall. It's not just about the billions of dollars spent. War consumes resources, destroys opportunities for development, and pushes nations to the brink of collapse. As budgets dry up, people fall into poverty, political instability rises, and even superpowers falter. So, besides the two world wars, which conflicts are considered the most expensive and costly to this day? The Vietnam War, a conflict filled with losses for the United States, the world's number one superpower. Despite possessing superior economic and military strength for decades, for the first time in history, 5 U.S. presidents and 4 war strategies could not subdue the Vietnamese people. Nearly 60,000 American soldiers were killed, with over 305,000 wounded, making this one of the costliest wars for the U.S. since World War II. On March 8, 1965, the first units of U.S. Marines landed on the shores of Vietnam, marking the beginning of an invasion aimed at rescuing the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. Over the next 10 years, the U.S. Air Force dropped approximately 7.6 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, nearly 3 times the total drop during World War II. Additionally, Agent Orange was sprayed over 20% of South Vietnam's territory, devastating agricultural land and affecting the health of multiple generations. The bombing campaign against North Vietnam alone cost Washington around $900 million. At its peak, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam, alongside a vast logistics network and a massive support fleet off the coast. The costs were not only for U.S. forces, but also for maintaining and supporting the Saigon government. Soldiers in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam were equipped and supported, as well as U.S. troops, even receiving enough to provide for their families. However, despite continuously pouring money and resources into the conflict, the U.S. failed to achieve significant results in Vietnam and gradually became mired in a quagmire. To support the futile war effort, many consumer goods factories were converted to arms production, causing shortages and severely impacting the economy. The enormous war expenses led to budget deficits, pushing the U.S. economy of the 1970s into recession. To sustain the war, the U.S. was forced to print more money, causing the dollar to lose value and inflation to soar, contributing to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, as the dollar was no longer pegged to gold. The deep divide between the government and the public, due to unemployment, poverty, and forced military conscription, led to numerous protests and strikes. It is estimated that the U.S. spent around $676 billion on the war, adjusted for 2004 values, making it the second most expensive war after World War II, surpassing World War I. Another calculation puts the cost at $950 billion in 2011 dollars, and when including veteran support, the total cost ranges from $1.2 to $1.8 trillion. The war not only inflicted economic losses, but also caused severe psychological effects. Around 700,000 U.S. soldiers suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, known as the Vietnam Syndrome, and 10% of returning soldiers were addicted to drugs. Between 70,000 and 300,000 veterans committed suicide after returning, profoundly affecting the next generation. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. veterans developed cancer or had children born with birth defects due to exposure to Agent Orange. After the defeat in Vietnam, President Richard Nixon admitted, "Never in U.S. history have so many resources been used so ineffectively as in this war." Despite being a nuclear superpower, the U.S. could not prevail against a small nation, and although it never officially acknowledged defeat, the truth was undeniable. However, to this day, the Vietnam War is still regarded as a significant turning point in post-World War II U.S. history and is taught at most military schools in the country. General Maxwell Taylor, a special advisor to President Johnson and former U.S. commander in Vietnam, succinctly summarized this defeat. "We all share in America's failure in Vietnam, and there is nothing noble about it. We have no heroes, only fools. I include myself among them." In the early 2000s, the U.S. continued to wield considerable influence, with NATO as its close ally. In the final days of Yugoslavia, ethnic tensions escalated. Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of Serbia, implemented measures to limit Kosovo's autonomy, sparking conflict with the ethnic Albanians there. NATO, supporting the Albanians, intervened with a 78-day air campaign. NATO used fighter jets such as the F-16, F-15, and Mirage 2000 to attack Serbian military targets and infrastructure. The U.S. Tomahawk cruise missile system and France's Scalp missiles were also deployed. This campaign destroyed half of Serbia's economic capacity, dropping over 23,000 bombs, and is considered one of the most expensive military operations since World War II. According to the Yugoslav government, the airstrikes resulted in over 1,700 civilian deaths, more than 10,000 seriously wounded, and economic damages nearing $30 billion. According to experts, the actual damage to Yugoslavia during the war is estimated between $60 and $100 billion, including losses to industrial facilities, transportation, and civilian infrastructure. NATO conducted a total of 35,000 attack sorties, launched 550 cruise missiles, and dropped 23,000 bombs, 35% of which were precision-guided munitions. According to analyses by the BBC and military firm Janes, the cost of the campaign for the European military alliance was estimated at around $43 billion. This includes the deployment of military forces, carrying out airstrikes, supplying military equipment, providing intelligence support, and post-war activities such as infrastructure reconstruction and resettlement of civilians. The conflict in Serbia lasted until June 1999, when Serbia finally accepted a ceasefire agreement with NATO. Afterward, NATO forces, along with the United Nations, entered Kosovo to establish a security zone, assist with reconstruction, resettlement, and reconciliation in the post-conflict period. This war marked a new political doctrine for the West, with the use of military power to resolve international issues. The U.S. also seized this opportunity to assert its leadership over Europe, especially as the Soviet Union had just collapsed and European allies were beginning to seek independence from American influence. The campaign in Yugoslavia was also the first step for NATO to become a globally influential organization, carrying out security missions worldwide while serving Washington's strategic interests. In Asia, the Korean War was a covert confrontation between the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the U.S. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, with Soviet support, crossed the 38th parallel, launching a major offensive aimed at unifying the Korean peninsula. With high morale and weapons supplied by the Soviet Union and China, North Korea quickly pushed back the South Korean army, forcing them into a precarious position in Busan. Just when North Korea thought victory was within reach, the U.S. intervened. Taking advantage of the Soviet boycott of the United Nations Security Council, the U.S. pushed through a resolution for military assistance to South Korea. United Nations forces, led by the U.S., were quickly deployed to respond. A vast array of military equipment and weaponry, including World War II-era battleships, were mobilized to join the fight. The war was not just an armed conflict, but also a clash between two political ideologies. One of the largest battles was the Battle of Incheon, where UN forces carried out the largest amphibious assault since the Normandy landings. The U.S. dropped 635,000 tons of bombs, including 32,000 tons of napalm, destroying most of North Korea's urban centers. The war brought immense suffering, as families were torn apart and brothers of the same blood were forced to face each other in a brutal spiral of violence. Korea was left divided, painting a picture of deep tragedy and emotional poignancy. Additionally, the attacks and airstrikes during the Korean War caused heavy destruction to the infrastructure of both North and South Korea. While the U.S. deployed troops and poured billions of dollars into supporting South Korea, China also sent millions of volunteer soldiers to confront the U.S.-led coalition. The war lasted for 3 years, ultimately leading to an armistice agreement that divided the Korean peninsula into North and South, a situation that persists to this day. The Korean War cost the U.S. about $341 billion. In 2011, resulted in the deaths of 34,000 U.S. soldiers, making it the first costly war for the U.S. after World War II. Despite the immense cost, the U.S. seemingly did not learn its lesson and continued to invest troops and money into the Vietnam War, leading to a defeat that many had already foreseen. After the war, the U.S. maintained military bases in South Korea, helping the country develop into one of Asia's dragons. Meanwhile, North Korea, despite initially having a strong industrial foundation, pursued a nuclear weapons program and faced numerous sanctions, leading to its current state of isolation. Nearly half a century after the war ended, the events of 9/11 shook the heart of America as the image of the Twin Towers collapsing was seared into memory, with over 3,000 people killed and 6,000 wounded in the terrorist attacks using airplanes. At the same time, the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington by 19 Al Qaeda terrorists on September 11, 2001, shocked the entire world. This event profoundly altered U.S. foreign policy, marking a turning point in the global war on terror. Following the attacks, the U.S. president launched the Operation Enduring Freedom campaign, aimed at eradicating terrorism worldwide, targeting regions such as Afghanistan, Iraq, the Philippines, Somalia, Pakistan, and Yemen. The war in Afghanistan became an enormous financial burden for the U.S., with costs estimated at $1.1147 trillion from 2001 to 2010. Despite spending hundreds of billions of dollars on military efforts, infrastructure building, and political support, the U.S. struggled to establish a stable and reliable government in Afghanistan. The failure in social and political development allowed the Taliban to regain control of the country. According to an estimate by Professor Linda Bilmes of Harvard University in 2013, when factoring in long-term healthcare and disability compensation, the total cost of the war on terror could reach between $4 trillion and $6 trillion, making it the most expensive war in U.S. history. By comparison, World War II cost the U.S. approximately $3 trillion, adjusted for inflation. Beyond the financial toll, the war on terror resulted in thousands of military deaths and tens of thousands more wounded. However, the outcomes of these wars are difficult to deem successful. Iraq remains mired in sectarian violence, while in Afghanistan, the Taliban regained control after the U.S. and NATO forces withdrew. To this day, the prolonged and costly wars continue, leading many to question whether all the sacrifices and suffering were truly worth it. Enormous sums have been spent, and thousands of soldiers and civilians have fallen. War has not only altered history, but also stripped away the right to life and freedom from countless individuals who longed for peace. Instead of fostering unity, the world has become a stage for superpowers to flaunt their strength. In the end, let us hope that we can collectively reflect on the losses and bitter lessons from past wars. If possible, we should strive for a future that not only maintains peace, but also builds upon values that are more genuine and humane.